The morphine was wearing off when I heard Jennifer's voice through the hospital phone speaker, crystal clear and colder than the IV dripping into my arm. "James, we've talked about it, and we're not bringing the kids to see you. Hospitals are just too depressing for children." I blinked slowly, my vision still hazy from the anesthesia. The machines around me beeped steadily, counting each heartbeat that somehow kept going despite what I was hearing. Through the fog in my brain, I tried to process her words. Not depressing. Burden. That's what she really meant. "Michael agrees," she continued, and I could hear my son's voice in the background, muffled but confirmatory. "We think it's better this way, Dad. The kids will remember you when you're healthier." The line went dead. No goodbye. No get well soon. Just the dial. Tone mixing with the rhythm of my heart monitor. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I stared at the white ceiling tiles for what felt like hours after that call. Each tile had tiny holes, hundreds of them, like someone had taken a needle and punctured perfect little wounds across the surface. I counted them because counting was easier than thinking about what had just happened. 73 years old, and I was learning what it felt like to be discarded while still breathing. The cardiac surgery had been routine, they said. A triple. Bypass that would give me another decade, maybe two. The surgeon, Dr. Patricia Hammond, had been optimistic. "You'll be back to your morning walks in 6 weeks, Mr. Thompson. Your grandchildren won't even recognize how much energy you'll have." But my grandchildren wouldn't get the chance to find out, would they? I shifted in the hospital bed, wincing as the incision pulled against the surgical tape. The pain was manageable now, but the first few days had been brutal. I'd pressed the call button more times than I cared to admit, not always for medical reasons. Sometimes I just needed to hear another human voice, to confirm I was still here, still worth checking on. The nurses had been kind. Rebecca, the day shift supervisor, always asked about my family when she changed my IV bags. "When are those grandkids coming to visit?" she'd say with a warm smile. "I bet they're excited to see Grandpa feeling better." I'd made excuses at first. School week, too far to drive, Michael's work schedule. But after 3 weeks, even Rebecca stopped asking. She'd just pat my shoulder gently and check my charts in silence. The truth was, I hadn't been surprised by Jennifer's call. Not really. The signs had been there for months, maybe years. Holidays that got rescheduled, birthday dinners that became birthday phone calls. Grandchildren who seemed increasingly distant during our brief visits, more interested in their phones than in the stories I used to tell. I remembered last Christmas vividly. I'd driven 4 hours to their house in Westfield, carrying carefully. Wrapped presents I'd spent weeks selecting. Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter, had barely looked up from her tablet when I arrived. "Hi, Grandpa," she'd mumbled, not moving from the couch. "Emma, come give your grandfather a proper hug," Michael had said, but there was no warmth in his voice. It sounded like a chore, like reminding her to brush her teeth or put her dishes in the sink. 6-year-old Tyler had been more enthusiastic, at least initially. He'd shown me his new Lego set, and we'd spent an hour building a spaceship together on the living room floor. But when Jennifer called them for dinner, he'd abandoned the half-finished project without a second thought. "Tyler, clean up those toys," Jennifer had said, giving me a pointed look. "Grandpa shouldn't have to crawl around on the floor at his age. At his age. Like I was already 1 foot in the grave." Dinner had been tense. Jennifer dominated the conversation, talking about their new kitchen renovation, their planned vacation to Cancun, Tyler's expensive soccer camp. Every topic seemed calculated to highlight how full and important their lives were, how little space there was for anyone else. "Dad's thinking about selling the house," Michael had mentioned casually over dessert. "Oh?" Jennifer's eyes had lit, up with interest. "That big place is probably too much for you now, isn't it, James? I'd owned that house for 45 years. Bought it when Michael was a baby, back when I was working double shifts at the automotive plant to afford the mortgage. It was where Michael had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where he'd brought his first girlfriend to meet me, where I'd hosted his high school graduation party. "I'm managing fine," I'd said quietly. "But think about it," Jennifer had pressed. "All that maintenance, the heating bills, the property taxes. You could get something smaller, more manageable. Maybe one of those nice senior communities. Senior communities." She'd made it sound like a gift. Like she was doing me a favor by suggesting I exile myself to a place where old people went to wait for death. That night, lying in their guest room on sheets that smelled like fabric softener and unfamiliarity, I'd stared at the ceiling much like I was doing now in this hospital bed. The house had felt different around me, like I was a visitor in my own son's life. The next morning, I left earlier than planned. "Thanks for coming, Dad," Michael had said, hugging me briefly at the door. But his eyes were already on his phone, checking emails or stock prices or whatever was more important than saying goodbye to his father. Now, 3 months later, that goodbye felt prophetic. The afternoon sun was starting to slant through the hospital blinds when Dr. Hammond made her evening rounds. She checked my charts, listened to my heart, and nodded approvingly. "You're healing beautifully, James. Your body is responding exactly as we hoped. Have you been walking the halls like I recommended?" "Every day," I said. "Sometimes twice." "Excellent. And how's your support system? Family visiting regularly?" I looked at her kind face, at the genuine concern in her eyes, and felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with surgical incisions. "They're busy," I said simply. Dr. Hammond paused, her pen hovering over my chart. In her 20 years of medicine, she'd probably heard every variation of family drama played out in hospital rooms. She'd seen the adult children who showed up, only when inheritance was mentioned, the spouses who couldn't handle sickness, the parents who discovered too late that love didn't automatically guarantee loyalty. "James," she said gently, "recovery isn't just physical. You need people around you who care about your well-being. Is there anyone else? Friends? Other family members?" I thought about my sister Margaret in Phoenix. We'd grown apart after our mother died, reduced to Christmas cards and birthday calls. I thought about my old co-workers from the plant, scattered now to retirement communities and nursing homes. I thought about my neighbors, polite but distant, the kind of people who waved from their driveways but never lingered to talk. "I'll be fine," I said, because what else could I say? That at 73, I was discovering that the family I'd built and supported and loved might not actually love me back. That the house full of memories might be nothing more than an asset to them, something to be liquidated and divided when I was no longer around to complicate the math. Dr. Hammond made a note in my chart, but I could see the concern that didn't fade from her expression. "The social worker will stop by tomorrow," she said. "Sometimes it helps to talk through these things with someone objective." After she left, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. 47 names, accumulated over 7 decades, of living. But as I looked at each one, I realized how few I could actually call. How many were just numbers attached to people who had drifted away, moved on, forgotten the man who had once been important enough to exchange phone numbers with. I closed the phone without making a call. Instead, I reached for the small notebook. The hospital had provided for patients to track their medications and appointments. On the first blank page, I wrote 4 words that would change everything. Time to write my will. Because if Jennifer thought I was a burden, if Michael agreed that I was too much trouble to visit, if my grandchildren barely remembered my name, then maybe it was time to remember who I really was. Not just someone's father or grandfather or inconvenience. Maybe it was time to remember that I was James Thompson, and my life still had value, even if they couldn't see it. The social worker arrived the next morning with a gentle knock and a clipboard full of forms. Her name was Sandra Chen, and she had the kind of weathered compassion that comes from years of navigating family crises in sterile hospital corridors. "Dr. Hammond mentioned you might benefit from someone to talk with," she said, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair beside my bed. "How are you feeling about your recovery so far?" "Physically, I'm doing well," I said carefully. Sandra smiled knowingly. "And emotionally?" "A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." That's when it all came pouring out. Not the sanitized version I'd been telling myself, but the raw truth. The phone call. The years of gradual exclusion. The growing realization that I'd become a stranger in my own son's life. Sandra listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking gentle questions that helped me dig deeper into feelings I'd been trying to bury. "James," she said when I finished, "what you're describing is unfortunately more common than you might think. Adult children sometimes struggle with their parents aging, especially when it forces them to confront their own mortality. But that doesn't excuse cruelty." "Maybe I'm overreacting," I said, though even as I spoke, I knew I wasn't. "Are you? Let me ask you something. If a friend came to you and told you their family had abandoned them during a major surgery, what would you tell them?" I thought about it. "I'd tell them they deserved better." "Exactly. You deserve better, James. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" After Sandra left, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. What was I going to do about it? For the first time in months, I felt something stirring in my chest that wasn't pain or disappointment. It was something sharper, more focused. Determination. Reached for my phone and called my lawyer, Harold Brennan. We'd known each other for 20 years, ever since I'd needed legal help after a minor car accident. Harold was one of those old-school attorneys who still made house calls and remembered his clients' birthdays. "James!" Harold's voice boomed through the phone. "I heard about your surgery. How are you feeling?" "Better every day," I said. "Harold, I need to talk to you about updating my will." There was a pause. "Of course. Nothing too dramatic, I hope? Just routine updates?" "Actually, it's quite dramatic. Can you come to the hospital? I'd rather discuss this in person." Harold arrived that afternoon carrying his worn leather briefcase and a concerned expression. After 40 years of practice, he'd learned to read between the lines when clients called about sudden will changes from hospital beds. "Tell me what's on your mind, James." I explained everything. The phone call, the pattern of neglect, the growing realization that my family saw me more as an obligation than a person worth caring about. Harold listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "I want to change everything," I said finally. "I want them to understand that actions have consequences." Harold leaned back in his chair. "James, I've seen a lot of families torn apart by wills written in anger. Are you sure this is what you want? Sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're scared or stressed." "Harold, if someone is scared or stressed, they usually want their family closer, not farther away. Jennifer didn't tell me to stay away because she was scared. She told me to stay away because I'm inconvenient." Harold nodded slowly. "All right, let's talk about your current will." My existing will was straightforward. Everything split between Michael and Margaret, with trust funds established for the grandchildren. The house, my investments, my life insurance policy, my pension benefits. All of it carefully divided to provide for the people I loved most. "How much are we talking about, roughly?" Harold asked, pulling out his calculator. "The house is worth about $400,000 now. Investment accounts are around $250,000. Life insurance is another $100,000. Plus, my pension has survivor benefits worth probably another $150,000 over time." Harold whistled softly. "So we're looking at nearly $1 million in total assets." $1 million. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having when I was young, working those double shifts to afford groceries and mortgage payments. It represented decades of careful saving, of choosing generic brands and fixing things myself instead of replacing them, of skipping vacations to contribute to retirement accounts. "What did you have in mind for the new will?" Harold asked. That's when I told him about my plan. It had been forming in my mind ever since Sandra's visit, crystallizing into something that felt both just and purposeful. "I want to leave everything to charity," I said. "Specifically, to organizations that help elderly people who've been abandoned by their families." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Everything?" "Well, almost everything. I want to leave Michael and Jennifer exactly $1 each. I want there to be no question that this was intentional, not an oversight." "And the grandchildren?" This was the hardest part. Emma and Tyler were innocent in all of this. They were just children, influenced by their parents' attitudes and decisions. But they were also being raised to see me as disposable, and I couldn't reward that mindset, even indirectly. "I'll set aside $50,000 for each grandchild's education, but only if they maintain a relationship with me while I'm alive. Real relationships, not just obligatory birthday calls. And the money will be managed by an independent trustee, not their parents." Harold made notes as I spoke. "This is certainly comprehensive. What about your sister Margaret?" "Margaret will get my personal effects, photo albums, family heirlooms, things with sentimental value, but not the money. She's done well for herself, and honestly, we haven't been close since Mom died." "And the charities?" I'd been thinking about this too. "I want to establish a foundation, the James Thompson Foundation for Elder Care. It will provide support for elderly people who've been abandoned by their families, help with medical bills, groceries, home maintenance, companionship services. I want it to help people who find themselves in situations like mine." Harold was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd said. "James, this is a significant decision. I have to ask, are you doing this because you want to help people, or because you want to hurt?" "Your son?" I thought about his question carefully. "Both," I said finally. "I do want to help people who are in situations like mine, but I also want Michael and Jennifer to understand that there are consequences to treating people as disposable. They've made it clear that I'm not important enough to visit when I'm sick. Fine. Then I'm not important enough to inherit from when I'm dead. What if they come around? What if this experience makes them realize their mistakes? Then they'll prove it through their actions, not their words. And if they do, I can always change the will again. But I'm not going to keep rewarding bad behavior with the promise of future inheritance." Harold spent the next hour walking me through the legal implications of what I was proposing. In Pennsylvania, children don't have an automatic right to inherit from their parents, so Michael couldn't successfully challenge the will based on being disinherited. The $1 bequests would make it clear that I hadn't forgotten about him or Jennifer. I'd deliberately chosen to exclude them. "There's something else I want to add," I said as Harold was packing up his briefcase. "I want a letter to be read at the will reading, something that explains my decision." "What kind of letter?" "I want them to understand that this wasn't a snap decision made from a hospital bed. I want them to know that I noticed every missed birthday call, every canceled visit, every time they made me feel like I was an inconvenience rather than a person who loved them." Harold nodded. "I can arrange for that. The letter will be sealed and read only after your death, as part of the will proceedings." After Harold left, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the fragile, temporary peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep, settled peace that comes from making a decision that aligns with your values. I was no longer a victim of other people's choices. I was making my own choices, and they would have their own consequences. That evening, Rebecca stopped by during her rounds. "You seem different today, James. More settled." "I made some important decisions today," I said. "Good for you. Sometimes, the best medicine is taking control of what you can control. She was right. I couldn't control whether Michael and Jennifer visited me. I couldn't control whether my grandchildren grew up knowing who I really was. But I could control what happened to the fruits of my lifetime of work, and I could ensure that my legacy would be about helping people rather than enabling those who had forgotten how to care. For the first time since the surgery, I slept through the night without pain medication. Austin in 2022 was a city drunk on its own potential. Everywhere you looked, someone was building the next big thing, convinced they were 6 months away from changing the world. My first apartment was a 600-square-foot studio in East Austin that smelled like the taco truck parked permanently outside and cost more than my parents' mortgage payment. But it was mine. The first 6 months were a masterclass in creative problem-solving. When you're bootstrapping a tech company with less than $20,000, every decision becomes a calculation between necessity and survival. I learned to code through the night and sleep during the day to avoid using air conditioning. I ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches for 3 months straight, because every dollar saved was a dollar I could invest in server space and software licenses. My mother sent care packages without telling my father, boxes of instant coffee, protein bars, and handwritten notes that usually said something like, "Dad asks about you but won't admit it," or "He's struggling more than he lets on." I appreciated the gesture, but I'd made peace with the idea that some bridges can't be rebuilt until you've proven you didn't need them in the first place. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Martinez ran a boutique public relations firm called Catalyst Communications from a converted warehouse in downtown Austin. She specialized in helping tech startups navigate the complicated transition from prototype to product, and she had a reputation for being brutally honest about which companies were worth her time. I met her at a networking event hosted by the Austin Technology Council, one of those awkward gatherings where everyone pretends to be interested in synergy while secretly calculating whether the person they're talking to could be useful later. I was there because the event was free and included dinner, which meant I could skip buying groceries for another day. Rebecca was different from the other attendees. While everyone else was pitching grand visions and revolutionary disruption, she was asking practical questions about revenue models, customer acquisition costs, and competitive differentiation. When she approached me, I expected another generic networking conversation. Instead, she got straight to the point. "I've been watching you for 20 minutes, she said, "and you haven't pitched anyone on anything." In a room full of people desperate to sell their ideas, that's either refreshing honesty or complete social incompetence. Which is it? Maybe a little of both, I admitted. I'm not great at selling things I'm not sure people want to buy. What? Do you build? I gave her the 30-second version of Hartford Digital Solutions, business intelligence platforms that help companies make data-driven decisions without requiring a team of analysts to interpret the results. Clean, simple, actionable. She listened without interrupting, asked 3 specific technical questions that demonstrated she actually understood what I was describing, then said something that changed everything. "I have a client who needs exactly what you're describing. Small problem, though. They need it implemented in 6 weeks, and they're already burned by 2 developers who overpromise and underdeliver. If I refer you and you screw this up, it reflects on my reputation. So before I risk that, I need to see proof that you can actually deliver what you're claiming." The client was Meridian Health Services, a network of urgent care clinics throughout Texas that was drowning in operational inefficiency. They had 7 locations, inconsistent patient flow, inventory management that relied on spreadsheets and phone calls, and no systematic way to identify which services were profitable versus which ones were bleeding money. Their CEO, Dr. Amanda Foster, had tried working with 2 different consulting firms in the past year. Both had charged substantial fees to deliver reports that told her things she already knew, without providing tools to fix the problems they'd identified. "I don't need another analysis," she told me during our first meeting. I need solutions that work on Monday morning. I spent a week studying their operations, sitting in waiting rooms, talking to front desk staff, observing how information moved through their system. The problems were obvious once you knew where to look. Patient scheduling was based on historical averages rather than real-time demand patterns. Supply ordering happened on fixed schedules regardless of actual usage. Most critically, they had no way to track which patients were likely to return for follow-up care versus which ones were one-time visits. The platform I built for Meridian integrated all of these data streams into a single dashboard that updated in real time. Suddenly, Dr. Foster could see which locations were overstaffed on Tuesday mornings, which supplies were being overordered at specific clinics, and which types of patients generated the highest lifetime value. More importantly, the system could predict these patterns and make recommendations automatically. Within a month, Meridian had reduced their average patient wait time by 34%, cut supply costs by 18%, and increased patient satisfaction scores across all locations. Dr. Foster was so impressed that she introduced me to 3 other healthcare networks, all of whom became clients within 60 days. Rebecca Martinez had been watching the results closely. "You've got something here," she said over coffee at Radio Coffee on Barton Springs Road. "The question is what you want to do with it. You can keep taking on individual clients and building custom solutions, or you can scale this into something bigger." What does bigger look like? Software as a service. Instead of building custom platforms for each client, you create one robust system that can be configured for different industries. Subscription revenue, predictable growth, venture capital interest if you want to go that route. The idea was both terrifying and obvious. Everything I'd built so far had been reactive, solving specific problems for specific clients. But Rebecca was talking about something proactive, building a product that could serve thousands of companies I'd never met. It would require a completely different approach to development, marketing, and business strategy. It would also require more capital than I had access to. "There's something else," Rebecca continued. "I've been talking to other entrepreneurs in Austin, and your name keeps coming up. Not from networking events or conference presentations, but from actual results. Word of mouth in this town spreads fast when someone consistently delivers what they promise." She was right. Over the past 8 months, Hartford Digital Solutions had grown from my apartment-based experiment to a legitimate business with 12 active clients and a waiting list of potential projects. I'd hired 2 part-time developers, both recent graduates from UT Austin, who were brilliant but inexperienced enough to work for equity plus modest salaries. Alex Thompson specialized in user interface design and had an intuitive understanding of how non-technical people interact with complex software. Maria Gonzalez was a data science prodigy who could make algorithms dance in ways that seemed almost magical. Together, we'd created something that felt bigger than the sum of its parts, but scaling meant taking risks I wasn't sure I was ready for. "What if it doesn't work?" I asked Rebecca. "What if we build this platform and nobody wants it? What if we're wrong about the market demand?" She smiled in a way that suggested she'd heard this question from dozens of other entrepreneurs. "Then you'll fail, learn something valuable, and build something better next time. But if you don't try, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you'd been brave enough to find out." That night, I called my mother. Not to ask for advice, but to share what was happening in my life with the one person who'd consistently believed in my potential even when I wasn't sure I believed in it myself. "Honey, you sound different," she said, after I'd explained the opportunity Rebecca had outlined. "More confident, more like yourself." "What do you mean?" "For years you've been trying to prove something to your father. Now it sounds like you're building something for yourself. That's a big difference." She was right, though I hadn't recognized the shift until she pointed it out. Somewhere in the process of solving real problems for real clients, I'd stopped. thinking about David Chen's approval, and started focusing on creating value that stood on its own merit. "Have you thought about what this might mean for your relationship with Dad?" she asked. The honest answer was that I tried not to think about it. My father and I had spoken exactly 3 times since I'd moved to Austin, each conversation brief and strained. He'd made it clear that he considered my decision a personal betrayal, and I'd made it clear that I wasn't interested in defending choices that were producing measurable success. "I don't know, Mom. Part of me hopes he'll eventually see that I made the right decision. Part of me thinks it doesn't matter anymore." "It matters," she said quietly. "Maybe not in the way you think, but it matters." 2 weeks later, I made the decision to pivot Hartford Digital Solutions from a consulting firm to a software company. We started building what would become Vision Core 2.0, a comprehensive business intelligence platform designed to serve small and medium-sized companies across multiple industries. It was the biggest professional risk I'd ever taken, and it felt like jumping off a cliff while building wings on the way down. What I didn't know was that 300 miles away in Phoenix, Chen & Associates was about to face a crisis that would test everything my father had built over the previous 25 years, and that crisis was going to force both of us to confront questions we'd been avoiding about success, failure, and what it means to build something that lasts. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2024. I was debugging a server integration issue that had been haunting me for 3 days, surviving on energy drinks and the kind of focused determination that only comes when you're building something that matters. The number on my phone showed Linda Chen, and my stomach dropped immediately because my mother had never called me that late, unless something was genuinely wrong. "Marcus, honey, I'm sorry to wake you, but I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else." Her voice carried the careful steadiness of someone delivering news they'd rehearsed multiple times. "What happened?" "Your father's company is in trouble. Real trouble. We lost Southwestern Automotive yesterday, and Wilson Manufacturing terminated their contract this morning. That's 43% of our annual revenue gone in 48 hours. I sat back in my chair, processing information that felt both shocking and inevitable. For 2 years, I'd been building Hartford Digital Solutions while deliberately avoiding news about Chen & Associates. It was easier to focus on my own growth than to think about what was happening in the industry I'd left behind. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that he's talking about selling the building, maybe closing entirely." The building. The same office where I'd spent summers learning that I'd never be smart enough, creative enough, or practical enough to contribute something meaningful to the family business. The thought of it being sold should have felt like vindication, but instead it felt like watching something important dissolve. "Mom, what aren't you telling me?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear the kind of background noise that suggested she was pacing around the kitchen, probably making tea she wouldn't drink. Both clients said the same thing when they left. They said Chen & Associates couldn't provide the digital marketing services they needed to compete in their markets. They said we were 20 years behind the industry standard. The irony was so sharp it almost hurt. 3 years ago, I'd tried to convince my father that this exact scenario was inevitable. 3 years ago, he'd told me that real business was about relationships and handshakes. That technology was a distraction from authentic connection. Now the market had rendered its verdict, and it wasn't interested in authenticity over results. "What's Dad saying about all this?" "He's not saying much of anything. He comes home, sits in his chair, stares at financial reports, and goes to bed. Yesterday, I found him in the garage at 11 p.m., organizing tools that were already organized. He's scared, Marcus. More scared than I've ever seen him. I understood that fear. I'd lived with it for the past 2 years. The constant anxiety that comes with building something from nothing while knowing that failure means losing everything you've invested. The difference was that I'd chosen my risk consciously, while my father was discovering that avoiding risk had become the biggest risk of all. "Have you talked to him about updating their services? Maybe partnering with a digital marketing firm?" I suggested it, He said he'd rather close the business than admit he doesn't know how to run it anymore. Pride. The same pride that had prevented him from listening to my ideas when I was 18 was now preventing him from saving a company he'd spent 25 years building. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you think he'd accept help if it came from me? The pause that followed was long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. I don't know, honey. I think part of him wants to, but he's ashamed. He's ashamed that you were right about the direction the industry was heading, and he's ashamed that he can't fix this himself. After we hung up, I sat in my Austin apartment staring at my laptop screen, thinking about family and business and the complicated ways that success can feel like failure when it comes at the cost of relationships that matter. Hartford Digital. Solutions had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I started. We now had 37 active clients, annual recurring revenue approaching $2 million, and a team of 12 full-time employees working out of a proper office space in downtown Austin. Vision Core 2.0 had officially launched 6 months earlier, and we were adding new subscribers every week. More importantly, we were solving real problems for real businesses. Companies were making better decisions, increasing their revenue, and gaining competitive advantages because of software my team had built from scratch. But success in business doesn't automatically translate to success in life, and I was starting to understand that some victories feel hollow when the people you care about aren't there to witness them. The next morning, I called Rebecca Martinez. I need advice about something personal, I said, but it has business implications. Those are usually the most interesting problems. What's going on? I explained the situation with Chen and Associates, my father's crisis, and the complicated history that made any potential intervention delicate. So you're asking whether you should try to save your father's business, she said when I finished. I'm asking whether it's possible to do that without destroying what I've built here. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her tapping a pen against her desk. A habit I'd learned meant she was thinking through multiple scenarios simultaneously. Marcus, can I ask you something? What would success look like in this situation? Best case scenario, what outcome would make you feel like you'd handled this correctly? It wasn't a question I'd expected, but the answer came immediately. I want to prove that the work I'm doing matters. Not just to clients I've never met, but to the person whose opinion shaped how I see myself for the first 18 years of my life. And if he still doesn't acknowledge that what you've built is valuable, then at least I'll know I tried. She laughed, but not in a way that suggested she thought the situation was funny. You know what I'm hearing? I'm hearing about someone who's successful enough to take a risk that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with closure. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I researched Chen and Associates. What I found was worse than my mother had described. Their website looked like it had been built in 2003 and abandoned. Their social media presence was virtually non-existent. Their client testimonials were outdated, and their service offerings read like a catalog of marketing approaches that had been superseded by more effective methods. But I also found something interesting. Despite losing their 2 biggest clients, Chen and Associates still had a roster of smaller businesses that had been working with them for years. Restaurants, retail stores, professional services firms, the kind of local companies that valued relationships and consistency over cutting-edge strategy. These were exactly the types of businesses that would benefit most from the kind of integrated digital platform Hartford Digital had perfected. Spent the next 3 days building something I called Project Phoenix, a comprehensive business plan for transforming Chen and Associates from a traditional marketing firm into a hybrid agency that combined relationship-based account management with sophisticated digital tools. The plan was detailed, realistic, and designed to leverage my father's existing client relationships while adding the technical capabilities that would make Chen and Associates competitive in the current market. It would require significant investment in training, technology, and probably some new hires, but it was absolutely feasible. More importantly, It was a plan that would allow David Chen to remain the leader of his company while adapting to an industry that had evolved beyond his current expertise. The question was whether he'd be willing to listen to it. I called my mother again. "I want to come home for a visit," I said. "Not to gloat, not to say I told you so, but to see if there's a way to help. Marcus, you need to understand something. Your father is proud, but he's not stupid. He knows you've been successful in Austin. He sees your LinkedIn posts. He's heard about Hartford Digital from people in the industry. He's just not sure how to bridge the gap between where you are now and where you left things 3 years ago." What if I made it easy for him? What if I came with a proposal that didn't require him to admit he was wrong, just that the industry had changed and we could adapt together? "You'd really do that? After everything that's happened?" "Mom, I've spent 3 years proving I could build something successful. Maybe it's time to prove I can build something that matters." 2 weeks later, I boarded a flight from Austin to Phoenix, carrying a briefcase that contained what might have been the most important presentation of my life. Not because of the money involved, or the business opportunity, or even the satisfaction of proving my methods worked, but because some relationships are worth more than being right, and some bridges are worth rebuilding even when you're not sure they'll hold the weight of everything that's passed between the people trying to cross them. Phoenix in April felt like returning to a photograph that had been left in the sun, too. Long, familiar but faded, details blurred by time and distance. The drive from Sky Harbor Airport to my parents' house took me through neighborhoods I'd known by heart at 18, but now felt like a tourist exploring. Strip malls had changed ownership. New developments had sprouted where desert used to stretch endlessly, and the whole city seemed to be wearing a coat of dust that hadn't been there when I left. My mother was waiting in the driveway when I pulled up in the rental car, and the relief on her face was complicated by something I couldn't immediately identify. Worry, maybe. Or the kind of cautious hope that comes from wanting something so badly you're afraid to believe it might actually happen. "You look good," she said, wrapping me in a hug that lasted longer than usual. "Successful." "I look tired," I corrected, though I appreciated the sentiment. 3 years of building a company from scratch will do that to you. "Your father's in his office," she said, and I noticed she didn't call it the study anymore. "He's been there since 6 this morning, working on something. I'm not sure what, but he's been more agitated than usual." The house felt smaller than I remembered, though nothing had actually changed. Same furniture, same family photos documenting graduations and vacations from a time when our biggest concern was whether I'd get into a decent college. The only difference was a stack of business magazines on the coffee table, all of them featuring articles about digital transformation and the future of marketing. My father had been doing research. I found him hunched over a laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts and handwritten notes that looked like battle plans. He was wearing reading glasses I'd never seen before, and his hair had more gray than I'd expected. When he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, his expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been relief. "Marcus." He stood up, closed the laptop, and extended his hand like we were meeting for the first time. "Thank you for coming." The formality was jarring, but I understood it. We were both navigating territory we'd never mapped before, trying to figure out how to be father and son when we'd spent 3 years being strangers. "Mom told me what's been happening," I said, shaking his hand and trying to read his expression. "I'm sorry about Southwestern and Wilson." "Yes? Well?" He gestured to the papers scattered across the table. "The market has made its position clear. Traditional approaches aren't sufficient anymore." It was as close to an admission of error as I was likely to get, and I appreciated that he was giving me even that much. "What are you working on?" I asked, nodding toward the laptop. "Research. Trying to understand what I missed, what I should have seen coming." He sat back down, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. "Do you know what's humbling about failing at something you thought you understood? It's not the financial loss, though that's certainly concerning. It's realizing that you've been so focused on being right that you stopped paying attention to whether you were being effective. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the weight of that statement. "I brought something that might help," I said finally. "Not advice, not criticism, a proposal." He looked at me with the kind of cautious interest reserved for opportunities that seemed too good to be true. "What kind of proposal?" I opened my briefcase and pulled out the Project Phoenix documentation I'd spent 2 weeks perfecting. Clean, professional, comprehensive. Everything I'd learned about presenting complex ideas to people who had reasons to be skeptical. "A plan to save Chen and Associates," I said. "But not by changing everything you've built, by adding capabilities that complement what you're already good at." For the next hour, I walked him through the entire strategy: how to integrate digital tools without abandoning relationship-based account management, how to train existing staff on new technologies without making them feel obsolete, how to position the company as a hybrid agency that could serve both traditional clients and businesses that needed sophisticated online presence. I showed him case studies from Hartford Digital's client base, revenue projections based on Chen and Associates' existing client relationships, and a detailed timeline for implementation that would minimize disruption while maximizing competitive advantage. Most importantly, I showed him how this approach would allow him to remain the leader of his company while leveraging expertise he didn't have to develop personally. "This is impressive work," he said when I finished. "Very thorough. But I have to ask, what's in this for you? Your company is successful. You don't need to get involved in my problems." It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself throughout the flight from Austin. "I've spent 3 years proving I could build something without you," I said. "Maybe it's time to prove I can build something with you." He studied the proposal for several minutes, flipping through pages and making notes in the margins. I watched him process the information, seeing his business mind engage with possibilities he'd been too proud or too scared to consider. "This would require significant investment," he said finally. "New software, training, possibly additional staff. We don't have the capital for a transformation this comprehensive." "Actually, we do," I said. "Hartford Digital Solutions would like to make a strategic investment in Chen and Associates. Not a buyout, not a takeover. A partnership." He looked up sharply. "What kind of partnership?" "Hartford Digital provides the technology, training, and capital for the digital transformation. Chen and Associates provides the client relationships, industry knowledge, and local market expertise. We split the revenue from new services, and you maintain full control of your existing business operations. And if it doesn't work, then we learn something valuable and try a different approach." It was the same answer Rebecca Martinez had given me 2 years earlier when I'd been afraid to pivot Hartford Digital from consulting to software development. The same answer I'd given myself every time I'd faced a decision that required more courage than certainty. My father closed the proposal and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something, Marcus? When you started your company, were you trying to prove me wrong, or were you trying to prove yourself right?" "Both," I admitted. "But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about you and started being about the work itself." "That's what I was hoping you'd say." He stood up, walked to the window that overlooked the backyard where I'd spent countless hours as a kid, throwing a baseball against the garage door and dreaming about futures I couldn't yet imagine. "I've made mistakes," he said without turning around. "Not just business mistakes, but father mistakes. I was so focused on protecting you from failure that I never gave you the chance to succeed." "Dad, let me finish." He turned back to face me. 3 years ago, when you left to start your own company, I was angry. Not because you were leaving, but because you were right about things I didn't want to admit. I spent 25 years building a business based on the assumption that The fundamentals of marketing would never change. You understood that the fundamentals don't change, but the tools do. He picked up the proposal again, holding it like it contained the blueprint for rebuilding something that had been damaged. "I'd like to accept your partnership offer," he said. "Not because I need the money, though I do, and not because I need the technology, though I do, but because I'd like to work with my son on something that matters to both of us." It should have been the moment I'd been waiting for. Vindication, acknowledgement, the satisfaction of being proven right. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new rather than the end of something old. "There's one condition," I said. "What's that?" "We do this as equals, not as father and son, not as mentor and student, as business partners who respect each other's expertise and contribute what they do best." He smiled for the first time since I'd arrived, and it was the kind of smile that suggested he'd been hoping I'd say exactly that. "I think I can manage that." That evening, my parents and I went to dinner at the same Romano's Macaroni Grill where my father had taken me 3 years earlier to celebrate the Southwestern automotive success. But this time, the conversation wasn't about validation or apology. It was about the future we were going to build together. And for the first time in years, that future felt like something worth building. 2 weeks later, I moved Hartford Digital Solutions headquarters from Austin to Phoenix, not because I was giving up on what I'd built, but because I'd found a way to make it bigger than I'd imagined possible. The real work was just beginning. The transformation of Chen & Associates happened, faster than anyone expected, including me. Within 8 weeks of our partnership announcement, we'd integrated Hartford Digital's platform with my father's existing client relationships and were delivering results that surprised even our most optimistic projections. The key was something neither of us had anticipated. The combination of David's decades-long client relationships with cutting-edge digital tools created a competitive advantage that purely digital agencies couldn't match. Clients trusted him personally, which meant they were willing to try new approaches they might have rejected from a stranger. And because the technology actually worked, their trust was rewarded with measurable improvements in their business. Performance. By September 2024, we'd not only retained all of Chen & Associates' remaining clients, but had added 14 new ones, expanded into 2 additional markets, and established ourselves as the premier hybrid marketing agency in the Southwest. But success, I was learning, creates its own set of complications. The call came on a Thursday morning while I was reviewing quarterly performance reports in the office that had once felt like enemy territory, but now felt like home. My assistant, Jennifer Walsh, knocked on my door with an expression that suggested the conversation she was about to relay was either very good news or very bad news. "There's someone on line 2 who says he represents Pinnacle Marketing Group," she said. "He's asking to speak with the owner of Hartford Digital Solutions about a potential acquisition opportunity." Pinnacle Marketing Group. Even people who didn't work in marketing knew that name. They were one of the largest digital marketing conglomerates in the country, with offices in 12 major cities and annual revenue approaching $500 million. They specialized in acquiring successful regional agencies and integrating them into their national network. Did he say what kind of acquisition opportunity? He said, and I quote, "the kind that makes people very wealthy, very quickly." I took the call, expecting a standard corporate development pitch about synergies and growth opportunities. Instead, I found myself talking to James Morrison, Pinnacle's Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions, who had apparently been tracking Hartford Digital's performance for the past 18 months. "Mr. Chen," he said, "I'll be direct because I respect your time and mine. Pinnacle Marketing Group would like to acquire Hartford Digital Solutions. We're prepared to offer $47 million for complete ownership plus performance. Bonuses that could add another $15 million over the next 3 years." I sat down heavily in my chair, staring out the window at the Phoenix skyline while processing numbers that exceeded anything I'd imagined when I'd started the company in my Austin apartment. That's a generous offer, I said carefully. But Hartford, digital isn't for sale. Everything is for sale at the right price, Mr. Chen. The question is whether our first offer reflects your expectations or whether we need to have a more detailed conversation about valuation. It's not about the money. It's always about the money. But sometimes it's also about other things: growth opportunities, market reach, resources for expansion. Pinnacle can offer all of that. He was right, of course. $47 million would make me financially independent for life. It would also mean giving up control of something I'd built from nothing, probably relocating to corporate headquarters in Chicago, and almost certainly ending the partnership with my father that had become the most satisfying professional relationship of my life. I appreciate the interest, I said, but I'm not ready to consider selling. Mr. Chen, I understand this feels sudden, but opportunities like this don't wait for convenient timing. The digital marketing space is consolidating rapidly. Companies that don't scale quickly get absorbed by companies that do. We're offering you the chance to be part of the winning side. Can I ask how you learned about Hartford Digital? Several ways. Your revenue growth has been remarkable. Your client retention rates are exceptional, and your technology platform is more sophisticated than most companies 10 times your size. But what really caught our attention was your recent partnership with Chen & Associates. Something in his tone made me pay closer attention. What about the partnership? It's an innovative model. Most agencies either focus on relationships or technology, but you figured out how to combine both effectively. That's exactly the kind of hybrid approach we think will dominate the market over the next 5 years. The conversation lasted another 20 minutes, during which James Morrison outlined Pinnacle's expansion strategy, their acquisition timeline, and their expectations for Hartford Digital's role in their national network. It was impressive, comprehensive, and completely contrary to everything I wanted for my company. After I hung up, I sat alone in my office trying to process what had just happened. 18 months ago, I'd been eating ramen noodles and debugging code until 3 in the morning. Now, one of the largest marketing companies in the country was offering me enough money to never work again. But the offer also forced me to confront a question I'd been avoiding. What did I actually want Hartford Digital to become? I found my father in the conference room, leading a training session for our expanded account management team. He was explaining how to interpret the analytics reports that had once seemed like foreign language to him, but now formed the foundation of every client recommendation he made. The numbers tell you what happened, he was saying, but they don't tell you why it happened. That's where relationship knowledge becomes invaluable. When you understand your client's business challenges, their competitive environment, and their growth objectives, you can help them interpret data in ways that lead to better decisions. It was exactly the kind of integrated thinking that made our partnership work, combining technological capability with human insight to create solutions neither of us could have developed independently. After the training session ended, I asked him to stay behind. "We need to talk about something," I said, closing the conference room door. "Pinnacle Marketing Group wants to acquire Hartford Digital." His expression shifted immediately from relaxed satisfaction to sharp attention. "What kind of acquisition?" I outlined the offer, the timeline, and the implications for both Hartford Digital and our partnership. David listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, approaching the conversation with the same analytical focus he brought to every major business decision. $47 million is life-changing money, he said when I finished. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about what we'd be giving up." "Which is?" "Control over our client relationships, autonomy in how we deliver services, the ability to make decisions based on what's best for our clients rather than what's best for Pinnacle's quarterly earnings." He was quiet for a moment, studying his notes. "Marcus, can I share something with you? When I started Chen & Associates 25 years ago, I had opportunities to sell or partner with larger firms. I always chose independence because I believed that staying small and focused was better than becoming a department in someone else's company. And now? Now I think I was right for the wrong reasons. I chose independence because I was afraid of change. You're choosing independence because you understand what you'd be changing into. It was a distinction I hadn't considered, but it clarified something important about the decision I was facing. What would you do? I asked. I'd ask myself whether the life I could buy with $47 million would be more satisfying than the business I could build by staying independent. That night, I called Rebecca Martinez in Austin. "Congratulations," she said when I explained the situation. "Pinnacle doesn't make offers like that unless they're convinced they're buying something extraordinary." "That's not exactly the advice I was hoping for." "What advice were you hoping for?" "I was hoping you'd tell me I'd be crazy to turn down this much money." "Would that make the decision easier?" "It would make it simpler," she laughed. "Marcus, do you remember what you told me 2 years ago when you were deciding whether to pivot Hartford Digital from consulting to software development? That I wanted to build something that mattered, not just something that was profitable. Has that changed?" The honest answer was no. If anything, the partnership with my father had reinforced my belief that the most satisfying business success comes from creating value for people you care about, solving problems that matter, and building something that reflects your values rather than just your ambitions. "I'm going to turn them down," I said. "Good. But you should probably have a conversation with your team first. $47 million affects more than just your personal finances." She was right. The next morning, I called an all-hands meeting for both Hartford Digital and Chen & Associates staff. 26 people whose careers and livelihoods were connected to decisions I made about the company's future. I explained the acquisition offer, the timeline, and the choice we were facing as an organization. "I want to hear from everyone," I said. "This affects all of us, and I think we should make this decision together." The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered everything from financial security to creative autonomy to the kind of work environment we wanted to be part of. In the end, the vote was unanimous. We wanted to remain independent. But what happened next was something none of us had anticipated. 3 days after I officially declined Pinnacle's offer, James Morrison called with a different proposition entirely. One that would test everything I'd learned about success, family, and the complicated relationship between personal achievement and professional recognition. James Morrison's second call came exactly 1 week after I'd declined Pinnacle's acquisition offer. This time, his tone was different. Less corporate salesman, more strategic chess player making his final move. "Mr. Chen, I respect your decision to maintain independence," he said. "But I have a different proposition that might interest you. Instead of acquiring Hartford Digital, we'd like to hire you as a strategic consultant for some of our recent acquisitions that are struggling with digital transformation." "What kind of consulting?" "The kind where you help traditional marketing firms transition to hybrid models without losing their core client relationships. Based on what you've accomplished with Chen & Associates, you seem to understand this process better than anyone in the industry." The irony wasn't lost on me. Pinnacle wanted to pay me to help their acquired companies solve the exact same problem I'd solved for my father's business. "I'm listening." "Our first assignment would be unusual," Morrison continued. "We recently acquired a mid-sized marketing firm in Phoenix that's been struggling with client retention and digital competitiveness. The owner is resistant to change. We think he might respond better to guidance from someone who's successfully navigated this transition locally." Something about the way he said Phoenix made my attention sharpen. "What's the name of the firm?" "Chen & Associates." The words hit me like cold water. I sat up straighter, my mind racing through implications I couldn't quite process. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" "Chen & Associates. We acquired it 3 months ago when they were facing bankruptcy. The former owner, David Chen, is still running day-to-day operations under our management. but he's been resistant to implementing the digital strategies we know are necessary for the company's survival. The room around me seemed to tilt. Everything I thought I understood about the past 6 months suddenly rearranged itself into a completely different picture. "Mr. Morrison," I said carefully, "I think there's been some confusion. I'm Marcus Chen. David Chen is my father, and Chen and Associates is our family business. We're not owned by Pinnacle." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Mr. Chen," Morrison said finally, "I think we need to have a face-to-face conversation. Are you available for a meeting this afternoon?" 2 hours later, I was sitting in the lobby of the Pinnacle Marketing Group regional office in Scottsdale, trying to reconcile what I thought I knew about my family's business with what James Morrison was about to tell me. He appeared exactly on time, carrying a thick folder and wearing the expression of someone who was about to deliver news that would fundamentally alter someone's understanding of reality. "Mr. Chen, thank you for coming. Before we begin, I need to show you some documents that might be surprising." He opened the folder and handed me an acquisition agreement dated 4 months earlier. David Chen's signature was on the final page, along with terms that transferred complete ownership of Chen and Associates to Pinnacle Marketing Group for $2.3 million plus assumption of existing debts. "This is impossible," I said, staring at my father's handwriting. "We've been working together for 6 months. We're partners." According to our records, Hartford Digital Solutions has been operating as a subcontractor for Chen and Associates, providing digital services under our management oversight. Your father never informed you that we owned the company you thought you were partnering with. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd experienced. Not just the business deception, but the personal one. Every conversation about working together, as equals, every moment of pride in our collaboration, every assumption about rebuilding our relationship, all of it had been built on a lie. Why would he do this? "Mr. Chen, I think that's a question you need to ask your father directly. But I can tell you that when we acquired Chen and Associates, David Chen specifically requested that Hartford Digital Solutions be contracted for digital services without disclosure of the ownership change. He said it was important that you believe you were entering into a partnership rather than a subcontracting arrangement." I stood up, my mind reeling with implications and questions, and a growing sense of betrayal that made it difficult to think clearly. "What happens now?" "Now, we'd like to offer you a position as Digital Strategy Director for our Southwest operations, reporting directly to me. The compensation package would be substantial, and you'd have oversight of digital transformation for all our regional acquisitions." "Including Chen and Associates?" "Including Chen and Associates, which means you'd effectively be your father's boss." The irony was so complete, it felt like fiction. 3 years ago, David Chen had dismissed my ideas as naive and impractical. Now, through a series of business decisions he'd made without my knowledge, I was being offered a position where I would have direct authority over the company he'd built and the approach he'd used to run it. "I need to think about this," I said. "Of course, but Mr. Chen, I should mention that this offer comes with a deadline. Pinnacle is restructuring our Southwest operations next month, and we need to know whether you're interested in leading that process or whether we should look elsewhere." That evening, I sat in my car outside my parents' house, trying to decide how to confront my father about a deception that had undermined everything I thought we'd rebuilt together. When I finally walked inside, I found him in the kitchen, preparing for what he'd told me was a client dinner but which I now realized was probably a Pinnacle management meeting. "Dad, we need to talk." Something in my tone made him look up immediately, and I saw recognition in his eyes. He knew what I'd discovered. "Marcus, I can explain. You sold the company 4 months ago." "Yes." "While I was moving my entire operation from Austin to Phoenix to be your partner?" "Yes." "And you never told me that I was actually working as a subcontractor for the company that bought your business." He sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly looking older than I'd ever seen him. "I was trying to protect you." Protect me from what? From knowing that I'd failed. That everything I'd built over 25 years wasn't worth enough to save without outside intervention. That the son who'd left to start his own company was more successful at 24 than his father had ever been. The pain in his voice was genuine, but it didn't diminish the betrayal I felt. So you lied to me. I preserved the possibility that we could work together without your success being overshadowed by my failure. I sat down across from him, trying to process emotions that ranged from anger to disappointment to something that might have been sympathy. Dad, do you know what Pinnacle just offered me? What? A job as digital strategy director. Your boss's boss. Authority over every decision Chen and Associates makes going forward. His face went white. Marcus, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. You were so afraid of admitting you needed help that you created a situation where I'd have to choose between working for the company that owns your business or watching them replace you with someone who will implement the changes you've been resisting. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us contemplating the complexity of pride, success, and the ways that family relationships can become entangled with professional decisions. What are you going to do? He asked finally. I looked at my father, the man who'd shaped my understanding of work, success, and the importance of building something that lasts. The man who'd also taught me, unintentionally, that sometimes the people who believe in you least are the ones who push you to prove them wrong. I'm going to accept Pinnacle's offer, I said. His shoulders sagged with what looked like defeat. But not because I want authority over you, I continued. Because I want to make sure that when they restructure their Southwest operations, they do it in a way that preserves what you've built while adding what's necessary to compete in the current market. He looked up, confusion replacing resignation. Marcus, I don't understand. Dad, you taught me that the most important thing about business is taking care of the people who depend on you. That includes your employees, your clients, and your family. Pinnacle owns Chen and Associates now, but they don't understand what made it valuable in the first place. I do. So you'll take the job to protect the company? I'll take the job to prove that the best way to honor someone's legacy isn't to preserve it unchanged, but to help it evolve into something even better. 3 weeks later, I walked into the Pinnacle conference room for my first management meeting as Digital Strategy Director. The agenda included a presentation on Southwest Operations restructuring, with Chen and Associates featured as a case study in successful hybrid agency transformation. My father was there, along with the management teams from 4 other Pinnacle acquisitions. When James Morrison introduced me as the new director who would be overseeing digital strategy for all Southwest operations, I watched my father's expression cycle through surprise, pride, and something that looked like redemption. Our first case study, I said, advancing to the presentation slide that showed Chen and Associates' revenue growth over the past 6 months, demonstrates that the most effective digital transformation happens when you combine technological capability with existing relationship strengths rather than replacing one with the other. I looked directly at my father. Sometimes the best way to build something new is to understand what made the original version valuable and then enhance it rather than starting over. After the meeting, my father approached me in the hallway. I'm proud of you, he said, not because of the promotion or the title, but because you've figured out how to be successful without losing sight of what matters. I learned that from you, I said. It just took me a few years to understand the lesson. 6 months later, Chen and Associates was Pinnacle's fastest-growing regional operation, and I'd been promoted to Vice President of Strategic Development. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation was happening in the relationships between people who'd learned to see failure and success as different chapters in the same book, rather than opposing forces. My role at Pinnacle had evolved beyond what anyone had anticipated. What started as oversight of Chen and Associates became leadership of a comprehensive regional strategy that integrated 12 acquired agencies across Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. Each company brought different strengths, Some excelled at creative development, others at media buying, still others at strategic planning, but all of them struggled with the same challenge: how to modernize without losing the personal connections that had built their businesses. The solution wasn't technology or traditional approaches in isolation. It was creating systems that amplified human relationships through digital tools rather than replacing them. We developed what became known as the Phoenix model, a framework for hybrid agency operations that preserved client intimacy while delivering scalable, data-driven results. The model worked because it recognized something that purely digital agencies missed. Business decisions are ultimately human decisions, and humans make better choices when they have both emotional connection and analytical clarity. Within 18 months, our Southwest region had become Pinnacle's most profitable division, generating margins that exceeded corporate benchmarks by 37%, while maintaining client retention rates that were the envy of the entire marketing industry. But professional success, I was learning, creates its own complexities when it intersects with family dynamics that have decades of history. My father and I were having dinner every Sunday, but these weren't simple family gatherings. They were strategic sessions where we debriefed the week's challenges, planned upcoming initiatives, and navigated the delicate balance between our roles as colleagues and our relationship as father and son. "You know what's interesting about working for your son?" he said one evening over my mother's famous lasagna. "It's not the authority structure that's complicated. It's the fact that I'm finally seeing you as the person you always were, rather than the person I thought you should become." "What do you mean?" "When you were 18, I saw someone who was intelligent but unformed, someone who had potential but needed guidance to realize it. I didn't understand that you weren't unformed. You were just formed differently than I expected." My mother, who'd been quietly observing our professional partnership develop over the past year, smiled in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for this particular conversation. "Your father used to come home from work talking about how frustrated he was that you couldn't see the practical applications of your ideas," she said. "Now he comes home talking about how impressed he is with how you turn complex problems into simple solutions. The difference," my father added, "is that I stopped trying to teach you how to think like me and started learning how to think like you." This shift had implications beyond our personal relationship. The other agency owners in our region had initially been skeptical about taking direction from someone young enough to be their son. But as they saw the results our collaborative approach generated, skepticism evolved into curiosity, then into genuine respect for methods that produced measurable improvements in their business performance. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who owned Desert Marketing Solutions in Tucson, put it most directly during our quarterly regional meeting. "Marcus, when Pinnacle first announced you'd be our regional director, I thought they were making a mistake. You hadn't run a traditional agency, you hadn't managed established client relationships, you hadn't dealt with the institutional challenges we face every day, but you've taught us something none of us expected to learn, which is that experience isn't just about time served, it's about pattern recognition. You recognize patterns in data and human behavior that the rest of us missed because we were too close to the problems to see them clearly." The regional success hadn't gone unnoticed at Pinnacle's corporate headquarters. James Morrison called me on a Tuesday morning in March with news that would test everything I'd learned about ambition, loyalty, and the difference between career advancement and meaningful achievement. "Marcus, I have an opportunity that I think will interest you. Pinnacle is expanding into international markets, starting with our acquisition of marketing firms in London, Toronto, and Sydney. We need someone to lead the global integration process, applying the hybrid model you've developed to companies that have different cultural contexts but similar operational challenges." The position he was describing, Global Vice President of Strategic Integration, would make me one of the youngest senior executives in Pinnacle's history. It would also mean relocating to Chicago, traveling internationally 3 weeks out of every month, and managing a portfolio of agencies across 4 continents. The compensation package would be substantial, Morrison continued. Base salary of $400,000, performance bonuses that could double that, equity participation in Pinnacle's expansion strategy, and Marcus, you'd be reporting directly to our CEO. This is the kind of opportunity that defines careers. I found myself in the strange position of being offered everything I might have wanted 5 years earlier. Money, authority, recognition, the chance to build something on a global scale, while feeling uncertain about whether those things still represented success as I'd come to understand it. Can I ask you something, James? Why me for this role? Because you've demonstrated something unusual in this industry. Most executives are either relationship builders or systems thinkers. You've proven you can do both simultaneously, and you can teach other people to do the same. That's exactly what we need for international expansion. After we hung up, I sat in my office overlooking downtown Phoenix, thinking about trajectory and purpose and the ways that opportunity can feel like both validation and trap. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for our regular Sunday dinner, but the conversation I needed to have wasn't about business strategy or weekly performance metrics. I got offered a promotion today, I said after my mother had served her famous peach cobbler. Global Vice President at Pinnacle, based in Chicago, responsible for international operations. My father set down his coffee cup and studied my expression, with the intensity he reserved for major business decisions. That's remarkable, Marcus. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about what I'd be giving up versus what I'd be gaining, which is, I'd gain money, authority, the chance to build something significant on a global scale. I'd give up the partnership we've built here, the relationships with our regional teams, the ability to see the direct impact of our work on companies and communities I care about. My mother, who'd been quietly listening while clearing dishes, sat back down at the table. Honey, can I ask you something? What makes you feel most satisfied about the work you're doing now? It was a question I hadn't expected, but the answer came immediately. Watching our team solve problems that seemed impossible 6 months ago. Seeing agency owners who were struggling to adapt suddenly thriving because they have tools that amplify their strengths. Working with Dad to build something that honors what he created while making it sustainable for the future. And would the new position give you more of that satisfaction or less? Probably less. More complexity, more travel, less direct connection to the actual work and the people it affects. My father was quiet for a long moment, considering something that seemed to require careful thought. Marcus, when I built Chen & Associates, I made most of my decisions based on what I thought success was supposed to look like, rather than what actually made me feel successful. That's part of why I ended up in a position where I had to sell the company to survive. What do you mean? I mean that real success isn't about reaching the highest position available. It's about finding the position where your capabilities create the most value for people you care about. Sometimes that's at the top of a corporate hierarchy. Sometimes it's exactly where you are right now. 2 weeks later, I called James Morrison to respectfully decline the global position. Instead, I proposed something different. Expanding the Phoenix model throughout Pinnacle's domestic operations. Working with regional directors across the country to implement hybrid strategies that preserved local relationships while leveraging corporate resources. It was a lateral move in terms of organizational authority, but it represented something more valuable to me. The chance to scale impact without sacrificing the personal connections that made the work meaningful. The decision felt right in ways that transcended career strategy or financial considerations. It felt like choosing purpose over prestige, sustainability over rapid growth, and partnership over individual achievement. Today, 3 years after that first phone call from James Morrison, I wake up every morning knowing that the work I do matters to real people running real businesses in communities I understand and care about. My father and I still have dinner every Sunday, but now we're joined by my wife Sarah, whom I met at a regional business conference, and our 6-month-old daughter Emma. who's already showing signs of inheriting the family tendency toward stubborn independence. David Chen finally got to see his son become successful, but not in the way either of us expected when I was 18 years old. And I finally got to prove that my ideas could create lasting value, but not by defeating the person who doubted them. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving someone wrong. Sometimes it's proving that there was more than one way to be right all along. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.